Hello and good evening. It's a warm welcome from me, Mroz. I'm the editor of TES, and thanks so much for joining us this evening. TES has partnered with the IOE on these debates from the very beginning, and I'm really pleased to be your chair this time around. We've had to take the debates online for the time being, but we want to keep them as interactive as possible. So please make good use of the chat function on YouTube throughout to share your views and questions for the panelists. You can also tweet about the event using the hashtag IOE Debates. Now on to the debate itself. This evening, we want to reassess school improvement. It's an issue that's closely bound up with how we hold schools to account, which was a point of controversy well before COVID-19 arrived. And that has been thrown open by developments over the past 6 months, the ramifications of which will be with us for some time yet. And we have a fantastic panel to help us reflect on how to make school improvement efforts more effective for more schools, and how the experience of COVID does or doesn't change that for the longer term. So we have Sir Tim Brighouse, who for 5 years led the iconic London Challenge initiative, and prior to that spent 20 years as Chief Education Officer in Birmingham and Oxfordshire. Tim has also been Professor of Education at Keele University. Leora Cruddas is CEO of the Confederation of School Trusts. Previously, Leora held posts at the Association of School and College Leaders, where she established the Commission for Ethical Leadership, as well as posts at local authority, trust and school level, working to improve the quality of education. And finally, there's Lucy Heller, who managed ARC schools from their foundation in 2004 and was appointed as Chief Executive in 2012. ARC has grown into a network of 37 schools and is now recognised as one of the highest achieving academy groups in the country. Via programmes such as the Ambition Institute and Mathematics Mastery, ARC has extended its school improvement efforts beyond its own schools. So we're going to kick off with Tim Brighouse. So over to you, Tim.
Okay, Anne. Well, thanks very much indeed for inviting me. Quick look back. Until the 1970s, we didn't think we could improve schools. It was that famous research by Michael Rutter in the late 70s that prompted some of us to think that schools could be improved. And I've spent most of my life being fascinated by the whole process of school improvement. There's a very good quote that most of our participants in this debate will know, and it's from Ginot, and it says about the teacher that they'd come to the frightening conclusion that they're the decisive element in the classroom. They make the weather. They can either humour or humiliate, etc. You'll know it well. And of course, the teacher, as Dylan William was always telling me, is far more important than school improvement, because the in-school variation is greater than the between-school variation. The danger, of course, is that we focus on that to the exclusion of the difference that good leadership of schools can make. And big question, is it possible from outside the school to have a profound effect on school improvement? Now, so far as in-school matters are concerned, I would argue this, that a map, I've always advocated the use of a map involving 8 processes of school improvement, one of which is leading creatively. Second is managing effectively. Third is teaching, learning and assessing. Obviously it is. A fourth would be creating an environment fit for learning, hourly, visually, behaviourally. A fifth would be doing school review on a regular basis. A sixth would be what do we do about staff development? For all of those, there's lots to learn, lots of subtleties that a school can make or break in improving themselves. There are 2 others that I think are relatively neglected. The first is community and parental involvement. And the second, perhaps it ought to be at the top, is student involvement. And I think that's a token issue. And if COVID is to do anything, COVID ought to be an opportunity to look at those processes, which we did in London, and say, how can we get better at involving students in all the aspects of the work of school? Because if they take responsibility, think for themselves, act for others, well, we're on a good path for school improvement. Just at the time of COVID, I'm reminded really that leaders in the leadership effort, leaders of schools, really need 5 qualities. The first is, and I think COVID highlights this, they need unwarranted optimism, emphasis on the unwarranted. How is optimism at the moment warranted? Must feel every day that it's a challenge. Second, crisis the norm and complexity fun. Unless you do think that, particularly at the present time, you're going to be in trouble. A third is a absolutely bottomless well of intellectual curiosity. And a fourth would be a complete absence of paranoia or self-pity. Now, if you think of heads of department, heads of phase, heads of schools, just as the teacher makes the weather, they create the climate, and they need those 4 qualities. They need a 5th in COVID, and it is spotting gaps in hedges. I once knew a very famous educational person, Harry Ray, who before the war was a teacher, and then during the war, he conscientious objector, became part of SOE. After the war, came back, did all sorts of amazing things in education, including founding the education department at York and teaching at Woodbury Down. I remember him well. An amazing character. And I had to write something and speak about him on the 100th anniversary of his birth. He'd been dead some time. And a lot of people went to it, and I called it Finding Gaps in Hedges, because what Harry Ray had to do in the Special Operations Executive during the war was find a hell of a lot of holes in hedges and scramble through and survive. After the war, he brought the same quality to thinking the impossible and actually trying things out. COVID now presents us with the opportunity, and we really must share the ideas of how do we find some gaps in hedges. I'm not going to go in the time allotted, but I will, in answering questions, into the question of beyond the school, how do they affect the climate and the weather? My feeling is, I don't know what yours is, that just occasionally governments do affect the weather, but by sending us volcanoes, thunderstorms and tornadoes and whatever. But that's my initial feel of what we need. Find the gaps in the hedges.
Thank you. You've painted a wonderful picture there of all sorts of strange effects, and I love the finding the gaps in the hedges. That's wonderful. But I'm not sure about the volcanoes and everything, but I'm sure we'll hear a bit more.
Yeah.
Over to you, Leora.
Thank you. Good evening, colleagues. It's a pleasure to be here tonight with such a prestigious panel. Last year, I was on a public panel with Sir Kevin Collins, who many of you will know was formerly the Chief Executive of the Education Endowment Foundation. And he said to me on the panel, Leora, can you tell me, do you think we are the best system at getting better? Fortunately, he did not wait for my answer. He said, I can tell you we are not. But this question intrigued me. How can we in England be the best education system at getting better? Well, I guess by more effective school improvement. So I'd like to put forward 4 hypotheses tonight. So the first hypothesis is that the goal, I think, is for every teacher in every classroom to be as good as they can be in what they teach and how they teach it. So the curriculum is fundamentally important. How to teach, I would suggest to you, pedagogy, follows from what to teach, the curriculum. So possibly the strongest school improvement lever that we have is the curriculum. So if that's true, then what are the features of a strong curriculum? Firstly, clarity about the knowledge content selected, what it is and why it is there. Secondly, that the knowledge content is organized by subject domain. Thirdly, understanding that skill is the fluent and internalized application of knowledge. Fourthly, the importance of sequencing. Foundational knowledge is given special attention so that there is sufficient knowledge for the next stage of learning. And finally, what we teach is inherently interesting so that learning is the primary motivator. So my second hypothesis is that for this to happen, for every teacher and every classroom to be as good as they can be, we need to mobilize for every teacher the best evidence from research at every tier. I don't think we can call ourselves a profession if our practice is not connected to the evidence. Unlike other professions, we are yet to build a consensus on the body of knowledge that underpins teaching. It is essential that we do so now. The early career framework, I think, takes an important step in this direction. My third hypothesis is that there is no improvement for pupils without improvement in teaching, and no improvement in teaching without the best professional development for teachers. I think professional development is both overlooked and misunderstood in England. In successive decades, we have believed that professional development is the same as inset days or days out of school. And as Peps McRae says, I fear that teachers grasp an idea, or nearly do, and then thrown back into the maelstrom of school, they lose sight of it immediately, or they try it and it fails. So what we are in fact trying to create is what Peps and others refer to as expert teaching. And I would recommend Peps' paper on expert teaching to you. He says teaching quality is arguably the greatest lever at our disposal for improving the life chances of the young people in our care, particularly for those from disadvantaged backgrounds. When the quality of a teacher's practice reaches a certain level, we might begin to describe it as expert teaching. However, we don't yet have a clear consensus around what this entails. And until we do, colleagues, our capacity to systematically develop, I would suggest to you, will remain limited. So what counts as professional development is crucial. Simply introducing some programs and hoping teachers will develop expertise will not work. We need to think more deeply on this. My fourth hypothesis is that strong structures can enable strong practice to exist in all schools. In other words, structures matter. They matter deeply, but not just for the sake of the structure. The job of school trusts, in my view, is to create the conditions for teachers to move from novice to expert, to build the powerful mental models through deliberate and evidence-informed approaches to professional development. I think through COVID, trusts have shown themselves to be the most robust structures in supporting their schools. And it is trusts that have the capacity to drive school improvement through a relentless focus on the front line. Therefore, I think trusts constitute an insurgent mission in our education system in England. This is the way that we will leverage quality in the school system and enable the vastly more powerful and sustainable school system in England to be born. It is the way, in my view, that we will become the best education system at getting better. Thank you, Anne.
Thank you, Leora. I was struggling to unmute myself, which isn't a problem I normally have. I think your point about professional development being overlooked and misunderstood is a really important one, which might be good to come back to later, because with COVID, there's even more of a danger of that happening than ever before. And it was, bad enough before. So thank you, Leora. And now over to you, Lucy.
Thanks, Anne. And with no pre-planning, it seems that our three segments sort of very neatly intersect, because I thought coming into this, I'm only slightly worried that in the spirit of debate, there'll probably be too much agreement. So it's going to be up to the questioners to find the areas where we disagree. I was pleased to have the invitation for this discussion, because in the middle of this pandemic, it has a slightly dreamlike quality, since most schools at the moment, I think, are preoccupied with fixing the holes that COVID made, and can only imagine a time when they'll be able to think about sort of improving what they've got rather than just restoring it to what it was. But it's great to have a chance to sort of slightly raise your eyes above the current thing, to think beyond hand gels and bursting bubbles. In that spirit, I was going to do a bit of sort of fantasy work and thinking about what we'd like, not from the perspective of sort of improvement in schools, which is, I completely agree, is where it happens, but what we as a school system could want from sort of the wider system in order to improve. And I think if we wanted better school improvement, then I think there are three things that would be a prerequisite at system level. And the first of those is a common view of what we're trying to improve, a common view of what it is that we want schools to do. The second is the clarity, and goes to Leora's point about structures, is clear roles and responsibilities for the various players at every level of the system. And the third is greater trust. Now, the first is sort of easy and obvious, that it's hard to make progress if you don't know where you're going. I'm not sure that we have a national agreement about what it is that we want schools to do. There are any number of areas where I think the confusion about sort of ways and means and what the desired endpoint is making life more difficult and making it harder. If we could get that, this seems to me like an interesting time to be starting to have that discussion about what we think, making use of the kind of chaos caused by the pandemic to really start a new national conversation about that. Part of what we would need to do is to sort out that clarity about the sort of about the structure as a whole. And the ARC mantra, which I'd have to clearly say we don't always deliver on, is fewer better. I think having really clear system, we're at national level, and again, it's a dream to hope that we're going to get the education equivalent of the Office for Budget Responsibility. But it would be great to have, in a sense, a longer term national view about what was required of the education system, so that we weren't buffeted by sort of changes in regime, changes in what sort of individual ministers decided they wanted to do. The middle tier needs to be sorted out. I'm now agnostic on the question of middle tier, beyond saying I think it is important that schools have a system of support that has clear accountability, clear structures, and has sufficient resource to provide that support in a meaningful way. If we had those things, and if we then had greater trust between the various players, I think you would then be able to provide schools with real clarity about what it is that you wanted them to do, the right mix of challenge and support, and the resources needed to do the job. And they could then focus on the real heart of school improvement, which is about what goes on in the classroom. And again, completely agree with Leora's point. It's about teachers in the classroom backed by really good, rigorous curriculum doing their job. So these are all big issues. We've only got a short time tonight to make this sort of starter points. I'm going to single out a single area where I think we could make a difference. It might be counterintuitive because it's starting in a way at the end of the process rather than the beginning, but it's assessment. And it's not a glamorous issue, it's not inspiring stuff, doesn't make the heart sing, but I still think that this is one of the things that if we could now take the time to rethink how we are assessing, it could make a real difference to how schools improve. I should be clear from the start that I'm a firm believer in the vital role that assessment has to play. I'm not anti-exams. It's essential to school improvement, and at ARC, academic rigor and really rigorous assessment are core to what we do. But for me, one of the things that this summer demonstrated is that we're placing too much weight on what nobody believes is an adequate measure of our students or even of school performance. I think there's a danger that too rigid a focus on exams as it's currently constituted puts our children at risk of being over-examined and undereducated. We need a richer vision of what schools should be doing and a richer measure of what students should be achieving at the end of their school careers. I think this is now, it's virtually commonplace. There are a lot of people talking about the need to sort of rethink. I hope that we can take the opportunity, in a sense that's provided by the current chaos, to really think deeply about how we remake some of the structures and sort some new ambitions for the system. Back to you, Anne.
Thank you very much. I do love that idea of make use of the chaos, and it ties in with the stuff that Tim was saying about think the impossible and try things out. I mean, this is the time where you probably can get away with some experimentation. I'm sure the assessment bit will come up. We've had lots on Ofqual today, just to remind us on the horror show that it was in the summer. So what do you think? What do you think? How can we sort of just, get that chaos and make something of it? What can we do? Who'd like to jump in? Well, obviously nobody is keen there. Leora, you haven't got your microphone on, so I'm going to pick on you.
Yeah, no, that's fine. I think we do need to be reflective about what we've learned during this pandemic. In particular, what we've learned about leadership in this pandemic. I'm not one of those people who thinks that we should tear up the piece of paper and sort of start again. I think we probably need less change rather than more change in the system right now. So some stability, I think, is important to give schools the space to be in crisis response and to manage the pandemic. While we think about what happens in recovery. I think there's loads that we're learning about remote education, and I worry that the evidence base on remote education is not strong enough. I worry that the discourse on remote education has become about the platforms and the IT infrastructure rather than about the curriculum. And what that risks is that the quality of what we're providing through those platforms is less about the curriculum and more about activities. So I think we need to give much more focus to how the principles of good curriculum structure and how those, or whether those are translatable into remote education. The EEF has given us some sight of what the evidence says in this area, but a lot more for us to do, a lot more for us to understand. So I would want to not throw everything up in the air and see what lands, but I would want us to focus on what is important that we need to learn to strengthen our education system as hopefully we go into recovery.
Thank you. Tim, do you think we're not looking carefully enough at what is important? Do you think we're losing sight of those things?
Yeah, I do actually. I think that our discussion so far has taken as read a fairly narrow interpretation of what the curriculum's about. So do we want all our youngsters to grow up thinking for themselves and acting for others? And if we do we think our assessment system, as Lucy is suggesting, comes anywhere near telling us anything about those two matters? A touch of thinking for themselves, absolutely nothing about acting for others. And yet I believe that that's what schools are about. They're about those two things. So we need to rethink the way we judge schools. We do need a richer assessment system. And we certainly shouldn't be wasting, if you went to Scotland or Wales, they'd be astonished that we run a GCSE system that gives over £150 million each year in profit to private companies when they run their exams perfectly well from the state with no drain on the schooling system. And yet we continue to do that. So there are loads of things that we can learn from our closest neighbours, as well as thinking through curriculum change.
Okay. Lucy, do you not think that the government, I mean, the government is just clinging on for dear life to the assessment system that we have? I mean, even after what happened, you still get the impression that they don't want to let it go. That there's no room for any imaginative thinking there.
No, well, and I can understand in the midst of the current crisis, it's not so much imagination as sort of consistency that one's looking for. But I mean, to pick up on Leora's point, I'm not suggesting that we want to throw up this year everything and this is the moment where you make the changes. I think we do need some intelligent thought about what needed is right now is calm consistency. And the only thing I would be pushing on the exams piece is saying, whatever you do, it would be great if you could give school leaders, school staff, school students the clarity about what's expected in this year, that to give them as much as you can, a clear path through chaos would be very helpful. So I would opt, whatever you're doing, to be absolutely sure that you're going to be able to deliver on it, rather than, as has been the case in some instances, of sort of sitting Canute-like against the waves, saying, no, we will stay firm, and then having to give in. The things that I was talking about are changing is more about taking the opportunity that's given to think long term, not in a rush, and very much, as Tim was saying, I think less volcanoes, more really thought through change would be what we needed. And then calm is just to try and reach a consensus and be much clearer that you're not making changes all the time at system level. You're allowing school to do the work with clarity about what's needed.
And may I come in there? So
yeah, sure.
I completely agree with Lucy on that. And I think we will be closer to that position when we mature as a profession. So when we are able to agree to build consensus around a body of knowledge. At that point, we are able to speak with more authority to successive governments and to make the case for the kind of evidence-informed reform that we want to see. While we have not got that consensus, while we do not have a body of knowledge that underpins our profession, we are at the whim of successive governments or government quangos. So I would advocate for, and I think a professional body does this could do this particularly well. So potentially the Chartered College, along with the EEF, curates that body of knowledge, which then enables the profession to have these authoritative conversations with government rather than to be at the whim of successive governments.
Okay, thank you. We've got a question from somebody watching. Do you think that there's a risk that once the immediate crisis of the pandemic has passed, we'll just revert to existing models of school accountability and improvement? And would that disappoint you?
Well, for me, if I can come in, Anne, on that,
yeah,
and say, I would be really deeply sad if we carried on as we were doing it before, because there's so much wrong with the existing system that could readily be improved. And we keep touching on some of it, which is we've become, when I started out in my career, the Secretary of State had 3 powers only. Now the Secretary of State's got over 2,000 powers. The Secretary of State decides which exams a school can take. The Secretary of State is even getting to the notion of saying, well, how should you teach reading at the age of 5? And based, frankly, now I'm all have pushed the notion of evidence-based practice as far as I possibly could. So getting people to say, well, think about the other evidence. I certainly never got to the point of thinking that one answer was definitely the right answer in all circumstances. And yet we run a system that's based entirely on that. And I would ask Leora to look at Nancy Cartwright and Jeremy Hardy's book called Evidence-Based Practice, a practical guide. Because there you will find a very clear guide to what can go wrong, both horizontally and vertically as you move practice from one set of circumstances into a different context. It doesn't say you shouldn't look at research, you should, but you should treat it with immense caution when you're translating it into inevitably a different situation with different variables.
Okay, thank you. Leora, do you want to come back?
Tim, I don't think I disagree with you on that. I think I use the word evidence informed deliberately as opposed to evidence based. I do think evidence should inform our practice. I don't think the evidence tells us what to do, because I think there are contextual factors that come into play. On the teaching of reading, I think the evidence is pretty secure on phonics. I'm not sure if there are other evidence-informed approaches, but I accept your point that generally speaking, the evidence can guide us in one way or another. And this is why I believe in the curation of a body of knowledge. I think we do need to build a consensus about the best bets in evidence. So what can we say with some security in relation to the evidence? Where are we less secure in relation to the evidence, but we can make good bets? And where do we need actually more research so that we can say anything with confidence? The leadership debate is really interesting, because actually leadership of education is incredibly under-theorized and under-researched. So there is very little that we can actually say with confidence around leadership, and there's much more work to do in this space. But I think on the teaching of early reading, I think the evidence is more secure. So I'm not sure I disagree with you, Tim.
Okay, thank you. I've got a question putting Lucy on the spot here from someone. What would you like to see in the place of exams, and would you do away with GCSEs?
I still see absolutely a place for exams. I think we just need a sort of richer notion of what those exams should be. And if we're thinking about GCSEs, I guess my preference would be to move to something we're saying, I think we need to look at something where sort of maths and English do seem to be central, and you would probably want to have something similar to sort of GCSEs. That providing the benchmark, I would be much happier to look at something that was more heavily based on teacher assessment, and saying, I think we've ended up in a sad position at GCSE where it feels in schools as though the only things that, if anything is worth doing, then it's worth examining. And I think we need to rethink, it seems to me daft in some of the subjects, that if you're talking about anything from sort of food tech to drama, why are we examining it in that very restrictive way? We should just be free to think of it differently. And it's as much thinking about not just the subjects, but what are the other things? To Tim's point, what is it that we want children to end up having had from their education, and how do we measure that?
Can I come in on that, if I may, Anne?
Yeah.
And simply say, I think here's another example of where, if the United Kingdom means anything, then we have at the moment 4 systems going in different directions. Northern Ireland closely yoked to us, but the Welsh and the Scots doing different things, some of which are very interesting to find out about. And certainly so far as next year's GCSE is concerned, as we move into this second wave of COVID, does anybody seriously think that there's going to be an exams GCSE a la 2019? Because there won't be. It's very clear there couldn't be with any fairness. Quite a few year 11s are already missing schooling, and others aren't. So we ought to be thinking very hard about it. Both the Welsh and the Scots have thought hard about it, and we should think hard about it. I think rather, as Lucy has outlined, you could have, as you could have had before about 8 or 9 years ago, accumulating level 2 courses, which is GCSE course, which people take when they're ready to take them rather than at one time. Agree with Lucy once again, certainly something on literacy and numeracy, at English and maths, at about that stage, but we should be rethinking assessment at 18, a combination of either predominantly academic or predominantly vocational, or a mix of the two, coupled with looking at those personal attributes, which are things which matter so much to youngsters in the future. And for me, just to finish it off, I'd argue that there should be an oral part of every exam at 18, because oracy is such an important feature in my life and in anybody else's life, and will be for some time to come.
Okay, thank you. Do you think, we've talked a lot about sort of professionalism of the profession. How does that sit with the sort of deep mistrust of teachers when it does come to assessment and when it does come to exams? I mean, that's why everybody in government wants to have that exam. So, you know, how do we reconcile that?
I don't know. That's what we do in England, but it isn't the case in Scotland or Wales. There is more trust. And surely we should get to the point where we trust teachers. If we can't do that after, you know, the 44 Act started with a trust for teachers and a partnership. Now we need to get to a new era after one of managerialism and markets into one of real hope and ambition. And part of that hope and ambition has to be taking teachers really seriously. Totally agree with Leora and Lucy that if we could get professional development done really well in the way that Leora has outlined it, then there's all sorts of possibilities for the future, because teachers communicate so much better with each other than they used to when I started out in teaching. Teacher moderation, for instance, is now relatively easy using technology in a way that it wasn't easy 30 years ago.
So if I can,
thank you. Sorry?
If I can
go on, Lucy.
Say again, I think we're horribly agreeing across the piece on this. So I'm hoping we'll have controversy at the end. But just to say, I think that the trust is going to involve in part a leap of faith, but it's only a small one. That nobody's suggesting that teacher assessment becomes is left to run sort of moderated. There are lots of ways that you would have of just doing a check, but we don't need the kind of complete lack of trust that is currently evidence. There would be ways of getting that through, I think.
You could. Can I come in? That one way would be to have nominated regional universities and the CBI doing validation and moderation of outcomes at level 2 and involved in the vocational academic baccalaureate at 18.
So Anne, I might inject a little note of disagreement here. I'm not sure this is the issue of assessment is a matter of trust or mistrust of teachers. I really am not. We wouldn't want an education system where teachers didn't think very highly of students and didn't want the best for their students. Unfortunately, what that translates into, if you rely purely on teacher assessment, is an over-optimism in the assessment process. Now, that over-optimism is a great thing because we want teachers who are optimistic about what young people can achieve. But literally, the fairest way of assessing young people, and particularly the most disadvantaged young people, is actually the exam system. We don't actually have a fairer way of doing that. So I think we can have a conversation about what assessment might look like in the future, and certainly my organisation's up for that. But I think that needs to be differentiated from what arrangements we put in place this year, because I don't think we do want to have a repeat of last year, which undermined public trust and confidence in the examination system. So I think it's really important, as Lucy said earlier, that when we do reach whatever the arrangements are going to be, the contingency arrangements are going to be for this year, that they are robust enough to stand the test of time, so that we do not have politicians making different decisions in January and then decisions differently again in April, it's important that we take some time to get this right so that the arrangements do stand the test and we can offer certainty to our young people.
Leora, I mean, the only thing I want to catch up on, I don't think that the failure this summer was about lack of confidence and lack of public trust in teacher judgments. It was lack of confidence in the mess that was made of the position we're in. Nobody, I think, would suggest that teacher assessment on its own was sufficient for all the reasons that you suggest, but saying we need just a different balance and we do need greater trust in the profession. And I think the sort of narrowness, I mean, it's that sense of, you know, an elephant balancing on a pinhead, the whole of the education structure dependent on the exams, which nobody thinks are an entirely satisfactory way of judging what students or schools have done. So I think it's just that rebalancing, and now is the time for a conversation on that.
I agree entirely with Lucy, and slightly at odds with Leora, because I remember when we had more than 3 exam boards, we had many exam boards, and what an experiment was carried out whereby youngsters took the English exam with one board in the morning and another board in the afternoon. 20 out of 30 passed in the morning and 10 passed in the afternoon. There's an error within exams that is concealed because it's secret and hidden. And frankly, what we really need is a rigorous teacher assessment system. I'm not suggesting that they aren't occasionally optimistic or the reverse. What I am saying is that with good moderation and validation, you could settle that. You could issue a license to assess school, and that if they failed, if their results were way out of line one year, they would be told next year you won't be allowed to assess, another school will assess for you. This one is reliable and this one can do it. There are ways around this, and frankly, we're the only ones that do rely on giving profit of that enormous amount to private firms for an exam system which was designed when people left at 16. Now they're not leaving at 16. It's crazy, it's expensive, and it's unreliable.
Thank you. Let's move on from assessment. I've got a question here from Nick Brooke, Deputy General Secretary of NAHT. Moving on from the expensive, he's saying, would the panel agree that expertise in school improvement has too often become a commodity to be sold rather than insight to be shared? And how important is place?
Shall I go?
Do you think that's true?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah.
I do think it's true. And did you end by saying how important is place? I think place is incredibly important. And the very best schools, and you do come across them, and we did in your TES judging, the best schools are schools that are firmly wedded to their community and draw on the community as a resource, and they have much greater success in the attitudes that they can develop amongst young people because they're working with their local parish, as it were, or their local town, and doing it really very well indeed. And incidentally, I'm glad Nick Brooks asked a question, because I know that the NAHT are going to bring out a very seminal and important publication on school improvement in about a month's time. I've no idea what's in it, but I know it will be worth looking at.
So, and I think we can divide school improvement into two epochs. The one epoch is where school improvement was done outside of schools, sometimes by local authority school improvement services. And I say that from having been a director of education. And then gradually from about the early 2000s, a new epoch where school improvement, the expertise around school improvement was seen to reside inside schools and inside trusts. I think the latter is a much more powerful model of school improvement, because it's people who are actually in the system and improving schools who are sharing their school improvement expertise. I think that the movement away from local authority school improvement services had, as Nick is suggesting, resulted in a tendency for school improvement services to become traded. And I do think that's a problem. I think that's a problem in local authorities not understanding that there has been a paradigm shift, and that the expertise around school improvement now resides within schools, and that we accept that it resides within schools, not that it sits as a traded service outside of schools and trusts. So I know that's somewhat controversial, but that would be my view.
And again, Leora and I will disagree about some of that. I always thought that school improvement of the whole of the London Challenge was based on the assumption that the expertise resided in schools, and that our job was to enable people to learn from each other. I spent 20 years in 2 local authorities spreading ideas from school to school, trying to make sure that schools learned from each other. And the thought that people now are lost in the public, from the public service, in contributing to developing our future citizens and helping schools do that, is a sadness to me. But I recognize it's gone, and I recognize now schools have to pay in order to get advice.
They don't.
I don't think that's the case. I think the two can live side by side and they're distinguished. I think there is still a huge amount of sort of sharing that's going on, to the extent that it's not, and there's the kind of competitive pressures, the sort of dog eat dog, I like you would regret it. But I think it's more, there is a huge amount of sharing that does go on. And I think some of the multi-academy trusts, many of the local authorities have been really important in that. The problem would be only that there is a lot of, to really get involved, to give huge amounts of time is problematic. And it's more that if you want the kind of detailed support, you probably will have to pay for it. But otherwise, the kind of good practice sharing, I think, goes on, and I think may simply not see some of that going on, Tim, but it definitely happens. And I know we've benefited as a trust, and I hope equally give back to the system by learning from others.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Let's move on to one that could be controversial. Is January too early or too late to restart inspection? Who'll go for that one?
Yeah, so yes, it's too early. If by inspection, what we mean is the reintroduction of the Education Inspection Framework and Section 5 inspections. It is too early, and there's a very specific reason why it is too early, because the new Education Inspection Framework depends on a fully established curriculum, and curriculum will not be restored in schools completely by January. Of course, curriculum is going on in schools, but even in the government's own guidance on the full opening of schools, the government doesn't expect curriculum in its breadth to be fully restored by January. And therefore, it is a policy contradiction to say that you can reintroduce an inspection framework that relies on that full curriculum in January. So my view would be that it would be a mistake to do so, not because I am opposed to Ofsted or opposed to inspection, or opposed to the framework, not at all, simply because I think the framework relies so heavily on that fully restored curriculum, which we will not see in most schools and in most trusts by January.
I'm afraid there's going to be no controversy on this one, because I think we're all likely to agree. I can't remember a time when school leaders have been under such pressure. I think at the moment, the commitment of the system needs to be on giving every support that they can. We are still not, as we'd hoped, in recovery from COVID. We're in the midst of COVID. The idea that schools will be in a position to have full inspections in January seems to me absurd. At the moment, we couldn't even have them sort of in the school. We can't, the limitations on having people into schools as such seems to me simply unrealistic and not desirable to do it.
So when do you think you would be able to have inspections?
Well, how about January 23?
2023. That's a good one. And what do you think Ofsted should do in the meantime then?
Well, they've got plenty of work to do in terms of survey work and finding out what's good and disseminating good practice. That would be fantastic. They used to do that all the time, and they would have been very welcome in the past in schools on such an occasion as this. But they're not, because of course they're associated with punitive inspection rather than survey work, which does constitute quite a bit of their work.
Yeah, that would be good to see. Right, let's move on to some others. What is the panel's view on how to support effective school improvement with a focus on pupils from disadvantaged backgrounds?
From an art perspective, sort of that's what we do. Our schools have very high levels of disadvantage, and that's what we were set up to address. So I think all that we do is focused on that.
Okay, because it has brought disadvantage to the fore, though, hasn't it? COVID. It's almost like it's been a surprise to everyone that disadvantaged pupils existed, and still we can't get our heads around them. I don't mean we. I mean probably the government can't get their heads around how to serve them, especially with remote learning. Tim?
I wonder if it would be possible. It's a very good question indeed, and of course it always has been, sadly, and I do acknowledge happily and pay a tribute to Lucy that ARC has done some extraordinarily good work in areas of huge disadvantage and changed youngsters' life's chances as a result of what they've done. But coming back to Ofsted, what better task for them now to do than to look seriously at that issue, find good examples, spread ideas as they used to before they were preoccupied with having to do public inspections, and they are an organisation that's really in a good position to do that by inquiring of the different trusts, of the multi-academy trusts and of individual schools. So the outcome of this period could be taking forward our knowledge of what works and what doesn't work. And
should they be spotting gaps in the hedges, Tim?
Yes, they could. Yeah, gaps in hedges. In fact, they could call their report "Gaps in Hedges" for the.
Thank you. Anyone else want to come in on that? If not, we'll go to another question. So, what role do or should government agencies have to play in school improvement?
None. So I think it's really important that we are absolutely clear about where school improvement expertise lies. It lies in schools and trusts. It does not lie in government. So I think we get ourselves in a muddle when we think Ofsted has a role in improvement, or when we think the regional schools commissioners have a role in improvement. Ofsted is an inspectorate, regional schools commissioners are regulators. They have oversight responsibilities, but they can act as a force of good in the system, but they cannot improve schools. It is head teachers, it is trust leaders that improve schools.
And how about, I totally agree with what Leora said, and I want to only provoke her by asking one question. How about those schools that aren't in trust?
I'm really happy to answer that question. They should be. It is.
You're in favour of the whole thing going into trust?
It is absolutely essential now that all schools.
How many trusts, Leora?
I don't know why I would answer that particular question. I think schools are trusts of different sizes operate effectively in different kinds of geographies. As Lucy said, the larger trusts have strategic capability and capacity that is really important to the system. Some of the smaller geographically based trusts do a very, very good and very important job in their geographies. What is important is that every school is part of a strong and sustainable group. In David Hargreaves' terms, such that there is deep and purposeful collaboration within and across that group of schools.
Yeah, what puzzles me, you forgive me for saying so, but there are 30,000 about schools, perhaps 25 to 30,000. There are already over 1,000 trusts. I know that the DFE is finding it very difficult to organise with 1,000 trusts. They would favour fewer trusts. Do you favour fewer trusts? Simply for how else can you be secure that there are going to be successful outcomes?
Yeah, so in fact, there are just over 1,000 multi-academy trusts. There are double that number if you count standalone trusts. I think I'm making the case that every school should be part of a strong and sustainable group of schools. Now, those groups might look different in different geographies. You know, a 6 or 7 school primary trust in a London borough is a different proposition from that same size 6 or 7 primary trusts, you know, in Cornwall, where you get rural deprivation and geographies are very different. So I think the issue of strength and sustainability is much more important to me than the question of how many trusts should there be in the country.
I suppose that, sorry to interrupt you, but I suppose we're back, aren't we, to Lucy's point about the middle tier. I mean, it is a debate to be had, and it is that tier that's going to be worrying about how best to promote school improvement. I agree with you.
Isn't that entirely? I mean, I think we need to be clear on sort of what we mean when we talk about the government agencies or that middle tier. I don't think they should be doing the school improvement, but they clearly have a role in it because they're partly deciding where support is needed and and managing that piece of it, aren't they? And that you would object to, Leora, presumably. You're saying they still have the, if you like, the gamekeeper role of seeing that it's working.
So absolutely. So, and we've had a lot of conversations in education about the middle tier, and to some extent we are fixated with it. I wish we would stop using that language, frankly, because I don't think the middle tier is one thing. I think there are a set of middle tier functions that were once done by local authorities and are probably no longer done by local authorities. Frankly, I am much more interested in system governance. What does good system governance look like? And how do we define, as Lucy challenged us earlier, to create a coherent system governance such that all actors involved in system governance understand their role and understand how that adds up to more than the sum of its parts. So my plea to you would be, let's stop using the language of middle tier and let's start building strong, robust system governance.
Right, well, I'm going to annoy you then by asking a question about the middle tier that's come in. So it's over the past 10 years, local authority school improvement services have been much reduced and their powers diminished by the mass academisation of schools and related factors. Does the panel see a role for the middle tier, as in local authorities, of system leadership in the future? If yes, what can we do to enable that to happen? I mean, I'm assuming, Leora, you wouldn't want to enable that to happen, but perhaps, Lucy, you would?
No, I think, unlike Leora, I feel we've had so many discussions about the middle tier. I remain now profoundly agnostic about how it's constituted. I just think that I completely agree, whether you call it sort of system governance or you call it middle tier, there needs to be effective governance of the system with everybody clear about the role they play. I think that local authorities are, you know, in many cases did a great job. It's now almost inescapable that I think none of them have the funding that would allow them to do that sort of as they were able to do in the past. So no, I don't think you're going to change that. But I don't mind who does it as long as they do it effectively.
Can I say I agree with the other two? I don't care what we call it, but it needs examination. And again, it's an English problem. The Scots and the Welsh have gone down perfectly reasonable different routes, as indeed have loads of other countries. I mean, if you look at Canada, etc., you can find plenty of examples that are different from our present rather chaotic system in England.
Okay, well, thank you very much. That's probably a good note to leave it on, our wonderful middle tier. So can I just say thank you to our three wonderful panelists, Tim Brighouse, Leora Cruddas and Lucy Heller. It's been a very interesting discussion and thank you for allowing me to chair it. Thanks.
Thank you for having us.